Welcome and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I think, Mina, we have a great mix here. I'm sure we are going to have very inspiring conversation, and I hope some fun too. So I also suggest that we leave some time towards the end of the session to take some questions from the audience. Nina, maybe you can let us know how people can engage in this conversation.
Absolutely. So in fact, we want to let you know how you can participate during this session today. So you can pose questions anytime during this session using Slido, and you can find a button on this platform to directly access Slido. And we will then address the questions at the end. You could also indicate in your question to which speaker you are aiming it for. But let's now kick off with our very first speaker, our colleague Carlos Moura from the European Commission. Carlos, last year we launched what was the first release of the Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer tool. And now, 1 year after, how is this tool and how does the updated release today help us in using data to tell stories about the world's most pressing issues? Would you give us a taste, please?
Of course. Hello, Mina, and good afternoon for all of you who joined with us today. So the Paris Agreement and the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are two of the world's most important landmark achievements. They call on all countries to adopt changes towards a sustainable and low carbon transition and to report on their progress. Climate, food, health, poverty, biodiversity, inequality, all of these issues are complex and they are inextricably linked. And we need to measure them in order to know if we are making progress at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Science tells us that we are still not there, and we are still not where we should be. We keep on overshooting the planet's finite resources. We are at code red on planet Earth. So humanity is unequivocally facing a climate emergency. World scientists warn us. And current pledges for action by 2030 would mean a temperature rise of 2.4 to 2.6 Celsius by the end of the century, far above the Paris Agreement goal. This according to the United Nations Emissions Gap Report. To cope with the challenges we are facing today, people have to change their behavior. They have to take different decisions and change current policies. The Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz said, "What we measure informs what we do. And if we measure the wrong thing, we're going to do the wrong thing." There is no shortage these days of data and measurement systems to measure the progress of our societies. Many indicator sets have been devised and implemented by European institutions, world-class universities, international organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, OECD, and by NGOs. The Environmental Performance Index, the Global Innovation Index, the Human Development Index are some of those measures. But each of them provides us with a piece of the puzzle. But to see the big picture, we need to search for those pieces scattered across that big house that is the internet. In many cases, we don't even have an idea of how many pieces we have available. And this has been a daunting task, not only finding what matters, but also in making sense of the data. We all know that placing numbers in front of people does not provide them with the information they need, particularly in the front of decision makers. You might even feel detached or even paralyzed by masses of data like this. Though this doesn't mean that numbers don't have an important story to tell. And connecting the dots is what we need. In order to have the right information at the right time, think critical about it and make the important decisions wisely. It is up to us to distill data down to information and stories that resonate with people, and what better way to do this but to have the right tools available. And this is what we aim to achieve with the Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer, to connect the dots. A growing home to over 100 well-known summary measures that can help us take the pulse of our societies and our planet. And more than a home, the tool is also a holistic package which allows us combining information from multiple sources in order to get a big picture view in any policy issue. Now, picture yourself trying to find out how the world is doing in the green transition. Green transition covers many issues, from clean air, clean water, clean energy, to protect biodiversity, fight and adapt to climate change, and so on. What if, instead of looking at one single measure at a time, we could look at all of them together? Over 20 composite measures put side by side show us where the different countries stand in each of them. These measures attempt at quantifying aspects related to the green transition in its broad sense, or in particular issues like clean innovation, ocean health, or climate adaptation. And they vary in their construction blocks and methods, the number of indicators, and the country coverage. But they all have something in common. Now, zoom your eyes to the right-hand side of your screen. In any of these indices, no country in the world has achieved the maximum possible score. If we look at the European Union countries, we can see that although the average performance is globally higher than the global performance, the gap is in blue, meaning that the European Union average is bigger than the global average. The situation is not homogeneous across the EU countries, with big gaps between the lower and higher performers. The Environmental Performance Index, developed by Yale University and Columbia University, is one of the measures taking the pulse of our societies. The environmental performance for 180 countries is defined along 40 criteria, and on issues such as air quality, sanitation, waste management, climate change, and biodiversity. Blue means better environmental performance. So countries such as Denmark, Luxembourg, Switzerland, UK, and Finland are doing well on average along the 40 criteria. But yet, a country's income level can determine to some extent its environmental performance. And countries with higher income are more likely to have better environmental performance. But the data also show that this is not always the case, and that our choices actually matter. At every level of GDP per capita, there are opportunities for better environmental performance. Several countries, such as Romania, São Tomé e Príncipe, or Central African Republic, with limited resources, are making efforts in environmental performance, rising above their economic peers. And this demonstrates then, when it comes to environmental performance, governments should have no excuse for inaction. And it's all those good practices that we try to evidence in this Explorer. Going beyond the aggregate scores and drilling down into the ingredients of this index can assist us in understanding the determinants of environmental progress and in refining policy choices. The dots in the first column are the scores of the 180 countries on environmental performance. The next two columns are the two policy objectives: environmental health and ecosystem vitality. And the following 13 columns are the issue categories. The highlighted dots refer to European countries. Now, zoom your eyes to ecosystem services, the number 9. This captures aspects such as tree cover loss, grassland loss, and wetland loss. And only one European country is performing well. And most of the other countries are very down the scale. Worrisome messages are hidden under the fisheries dimensions, the number 11. and not only for European countries, but for the entire world. The COP27 is taking place in Egypt. So what do a series of international measures tell us about how Egypt is doing on climate action? We look at 8 indices measuring aspects related to climate. The plethora of dots in the image here show us where Egypt is doing good and not so good. The blue dots tell us that Egypt is doing good overall. It's the first column. In the Climate Change Performance Index, Ecological Threat Report, and is also doing okay on the Notre Dame's Climate Adaptation Index, the SDG Index, and Ocean Sustainability, as it's measured by the MIT Blue in Technology Barometer. In the Climate Change Performance Index, Egypt is among the middle top performers, the 18th position in 60 countries. And within this index is a top performer in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and energy use, the dark blue dots. And yet, Egypt is lagging behind in renewable energy, the yellow dot, and slowly catching up in terms of climate policy, the light blue dot. By focusing our eyes on the yellow dots, this is where Egypt has still room for improvements to catch up with the top performers. With so much change happening around us and with so much more transformation still needed to get us to where we should be to achieve the global goals of climate change and sustainable development, we need to measure our progress. And this tool aims to open a world of opportunities from learning from best practices to understanding the synergies between different policy areas. This is one of the examples of how at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, we are doing our best to connect the dots of data and science to help make progress on Europe's and global changes. The Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer builds on 20 years of experience and over 100 collaborations with international organizations, universities, and policy departments of the European Commission. To transform our societies, we'll need to win both the minds and the hearts of people. And data alone cannot do that. We'll need the most powerful stories to move people to take action and change behavior. And this is why we are launching today a new data stories blog within our tool and invite all of you to become a contributor. We must remember how we all enjoy reading a good story. If we can translate science into stories that resonate with people's emotions, we can contribute to the major transformation our world needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for this, for sharing this with us today. So indeed, the Explorer is the go-to source when anyone is looking for data, particularly on these composite measures, which are measuring some of the world's most complex issues. And I see it's not only about data, but it's also all these visuals which help us make better sense of the data and feed into any of the pieces or articles that could go to this data stories blog launched today. So we do hope having many of you contributing to this collective goal here. I think it's now time to move to the conversation. As we mentioned at the beginning of the session, we leave the questions towards the end to all of the speakers. I would like now to move on to this conversation on translating data into stories as a way to communicate messages to the audiences. And I would like also to explore with our guests here today how a tool like the Composite Indication Scoreboards Explorer could help them in finding data and narratives to support their work. Max, I would like to start with you. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, hope you are doing good. Max, You are heading the inequality policy work at Oxfam International, and we have seen that you've been pretty busy lately, so thanks very much for joining us today. Last month, you launched the 2022 edition of the Commitment to Inequality Index, which measures what countries are doing or not doing to reduce inequality. It grabbed a lot of media attention, as it did your recent study looking at the investments of billionaires and their impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So tell us, what's your trick to make your message pass? And can you share with us your experience, what works, what does not work, in what you've been doing? And also, how do you see a tool like the Composite Indicator Scoreboards Explorer helping further in your work? So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. And thanks for this opportunity, and a massive thank you to the JRC, who have audited our commitment to reducing inequality index. It's the 4th edition that we published last month, and they've been with us from the beginning and immensely helpful in giving that strong statistical overview, great comments, great support, and just keep doing the amazing work you're doing. So, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about our CRI indicator. I mean, the first thing to say is that indexes are, by their very nature, cool things to publish because everyone likes a competition. People need to know who's best and who's worst. So in that sense, the ability to turn them into a story is somewhat easier than a kind of standard report. And there's also an individual story for every single country on an index, or every single thing on an index. In our case, it's countries. But that initial thing is there for you, but to make it work is quite complicated. So and over the years we've learned a lot. You know, in Oxfam we're able to launch the index. We have many Oxfams around the world, many Oxfam country programs. So I think you know, partnering or working with an organization that has quite a big global reach that can put out press releases in lots of different places is obviously a big thing that's well worth doing if you're working on an index. So I would encourage people to do that and think of who you can connect with that has the ability to put press releases out in 10 or 20 countries, that has the ability to do it in lots of languages, because I mean, obviously that's very practical, very important. And then we work really hard with each country to try and tell a story of the index that's relevant to them. And I'd say, first of all, at least there's 161 countries, at least 10 or 20 of those will say that we don't want to launch this index, or at least we just want to look at the global headlines, because generally, in our case, it's because their country does too well in the index and is not helpful for them because they're advocating for their government to do more. So, for instance, our colleagues in Denmark really struggle because Denmark always comes quite near the top. And despite the fact that the Danish government over the last 20 years has done a lot that's bad, you know, they've cut taxes on the richest, they've cut social spending, they're trading on the glories of the past, if you like. So an index launch is never the same group of countries each time that wants to launch it. But there's always a significant number of countries that really want to. So working with them to make that work for their political moment. And I'll give you one example. So sadly, the Swedish government has just moved over to the right. We've got a right-wing coalition. Sweden was the top of our index like 5-6 years ago, and now it's slipped down to 9th or 10th position. So Oxfam Sweden launched the index for the first time because they felt it told a story that was, you know, that the shine was coming off the crown of the Swedish inequality story, if you like, and that the index would be really useful for them. So that did really well. So it got lots and lots of coverage in Sweden, you know. So I think it's just one example. I think in every continent, in every country, there is a story to tell, but it does require a bit more work than the average paper where you're just putting out 1 or 2 global facts and then you're asking people to share those facts around the world. The other thing I'd say was we worked really hard to kind of lean into the story of the moment. So the last two indexes we've tried to zero in on facts within our index that kind of link back to the pandemic. So, a headline fact this time around was that 95% of the countries we'd looked at had failed to increase taxation on the richest during the pandemic, and that over half of the poorest countries had actually cut their health spending in the middle of this insane global health emergency. And I think that they're not just good facts, they're facts that may make people think. So I think most people out there in the world would assume that if governments did anything during the pandemic, they did manage to increase the amount of money they spent on health. So to hear that over half of the world's poorest countries were unable to do that is a kind of, in what in media terms we would call a man bites dog story. It's not something people expect. And I would say that's the other thing with indexes is Oxfam is very famous for bad news and telling the world that it's, the inequality crisis is out of control, and all of these things are true. But one of the great things about an index is you have both good guys and bad guys. So what I love about this project is also being able to tell the stories of governments that are doing the right thing. And again, an index enables you to do that. And they're often countries that people perhaps don't think about that often or haven't really heard about. So another example, so a country like Costa Rica increased the taxation of richest people. So did Argentina. In recent years, we've had really progressive policies by the government of Korea. So again, hearing Oxfam tell a positive story and contrasting that with all the other governments that are failing to do the right thing, again, an index enables you to do that. It enables you to tell good stories and bad stories. And positive stories people like to hear good news. They like to hear that things are possible, that changes can happen. All within the parameter that no government is obviously doing as much as it can, which is what we were hearing about just now. And every index, even the people at the very top, could do a lot more. So I would say it's kind of, it's a mixture of skills that we would have in all of our Oxfam reports, and that would be very good media people that are very good at getting to the key messages and the kind of infrastructure that enables us to launch in lots of places at once and in different languages. And then specific to indexes, I would say really trying to zero in on the individual stories for particular countries, finding out which countries where the index can really hit the headlines. And it has to be counterintuitive. If they've slipped down or if, comparing them to their peers is really useful. So if we can show the Indian government that they're behind the government of Pakistan on a range of different indicators, they care more about that than they care about slipping behind, Spain or Brazil. So leaning into those kind of regional rivalries, those kind of traditional, comparators, because every nation has another nation that they look to and they compare themselves with. So all of that takes a bit of skill and a bit of work, but if you do that well, then your index can have multiple different stories in lots of different environments. And then the last thing, and I'll finish here, is I think it's really good to pick a fight with some governments, and we're able to do that as Oxfam, particularly with governments where we don't have an Oxfam office. So the government is not going to suddenly threaten our office, which does happen in many countries. So a couple of years ago, we accused we didn't accuse, but we pointed out that Singapore did very badly in our index, mainly because they're a notorious tax haven. And this really caught the imagination of the Singaporean press, and they were really angry with Oxfam, and they slammed the index, and they said it was full of lies. And we even got a comment from the finance minister. He did a press conference about it. And for us, that's all fantastic publicity, because we want the world to be talking about what needs to be done to fight inequality, and what better way to do that than to ruffle the feathers of some governments. I think all in all, it's a big job to make a complex project like an index land, and in a way that delivers for lots of countries. It's never quite the same group of countries each time, so you have to be rolling with that. And but if you can pull it off, then it's it's an amazing way to contribute to a debate, which is why we continue to do this index and continue to work with the JRC. I think I'll stop there. I think that's probably about it.
Okay, thanks so much for sharing. It was lovely to hear your experience with the index, with the Committee to Reducing Inequality Index. So really nice. Thanks so much for sharing this. I would now like to move to Guillaume. Hello, Guillaume. Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
So Guillaume, tell us, sustainable development, and in particular measuring it with the Sustainable Development Goals Index and Dashboard, has been taking part of your life for a number of years now. I don't know how many, but I think quite some. You are at the Sustainable Development Solution Network. And I'd like to ask you, in your experience, what have been the best ways to advocate for and to accelerate transformational change with the SDG index? And what do people or politicians pay more attention to? Also, from your perspective, you can offer some insights on how you think this new tool, the Composite Indicator Scoreboard Explorer, can also support your efforts in promoting this transformational change. So over to you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, and I'll try to make sure I stick to the 5 minutes. I'll say three things. First is about the GRC Center of Competence on Composite Indicators. I think this is really a unique center of expertise that's doing phenomenal work in monitoring, auditing indices. So our SDG index has been audited by the GRC. We learned a lot through this, both in terms of how to build those composite indices as scientifically as possible, but also all the things that you can do to make sure that you are transparent, that you provide sensitivity tests and so on, which I think is really important, because that's part of the nature of composite indices. There's decisions, choices that are made that impact the results, but I think it's very important to provide readers and users with enough knowledge around how to replicate the results, but also on how different choices could have led to different results. And I think this is all what the GRC Center is offering, and especially this COIN team. At the end of the day, we're operating at the border between science and communications, and so it's important to provide all those additional tests, and transparency matters a lot. The second thing is about the Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer. Actually, before the session, I was just playing a little bit with the tool. I think it's phenomenal. It's extremely useful. I think there's 118 indices in there. I think it's quite well structured. I mean, both between the European Commission priorities, but also about the SDGs. Obviously, at SDSN, we think this is a good idea also to display the SDGs in there. And I think there's really three main, I would say, value of that Explorer is, one, it's a repository, so it allows to identify new indices and indicators. It's also an analytical tool, and I think your colleague Carlos just showed it previously, how much can be done actually with the tool in terms of comparing results, relative performance by income level, but also looking at things like construct, convergence, validity between different indices that are supposed to measure similar phenomenon, but trying to deep dive into what explain differences between indices. And just to say that on our side, on the topic of SDGs, we've documented in an article why our results are somewhat different than what Eurostat, the OECD, and other organizations have done, for instance. So I think documenting this is important, and I think the tool provides a very useful platform for doing this. And then the narrative aspect. I mean, I think this is what also Carlos was showing in his presentation, the fact that there is, I believe, sort of a blog format now, which is, of course, very important. I think it's important to provide the data, but also to help also interpret and build nice stories around this if we want to change the world, as I think is the topic of our conversation today. So those are the two first things. The last point I wanted to make, and this is to respond to your question, Anna, is about our work when it comes to monitoring the sustainable development goals. So we are known for doing every year one of the lead report internationally that tracks the performance of all UN member states on the 17 SDGs. It's been peer reviewed by Cambridge University Press, also by Nature Geoscience, and audited by the by the JRC. So our experience is obviously that, ranking, the race to the top aspect attracts a lot of attention. I think overall, we would probably lose 70 to 80% of media coverage if we were to remove the overall aggregation in there. And I think this, media attention is also useful because at the end of the day, if we want the SDGs to be a success, there needs to be a little bit of awareness around those issues. And so they help build awareness around those aspects. So we've published the 7th edition of our global report in June. We're actually going to launch our European edition, the 4th European edition, on the 5th of December, so in a couple of weeks. And I think here there's 3 things I would emphasize is, one, the importance of the process. So besides the output in itself, I think, all the time that we spend with our network of scientists and experts that contribute to this, with the data providers, with the users of the report, doing workshops. We were in Brussels 2 weeks ago where we discussed the draft findings. I mean, all the process is very important also, and actually kickstarts very important conversations around what do we do based on the results. And then the narrative is, of course, very important. I mean, on our side, we've been advocating, obviously, for an increased financing for this agenda. There will be an important Heads of State Summit on the Sustainable Development Goals in September 2023. The EU is currently preparing its first voluntary review, and then there will be also a Summit of the Future in 2024. I think if we are to restore and accelerate progress on this agenda, we will need extra financing. And I think this is what our last report has shown when we plot SDG index results versus expenditure, general government expenditure per capita. Basically, you do see that there is some sort of relationship between general government expenditure and SDG index outcomes, which tends to be very important, especially among countries that spend very little. So if every extra dollar spent actually leads to a significant improvement actually in SDG index score. At higher levels, it's less clear whether extra expenditure make the difference, but at lower levels, it does make a difference. And so, in terms of interpreting our results, some of the countries that are at the top, all of them still have work to do on this agenda. The rich countries need to work on their consumption impacts, diets, but also negative spillovers, outsourcing impacts to the rest of the world, which is something I think our work has been promoting quite a bit over the past couple of years. And then at the bottom of the ranking, of course, there are major issues on this agenda. The point here is not to point finger at those countries, but to say, well, maybe those countries need help, right? In terms of financing, but also in terms of beefing up multilateralism and international cooperation so that even the low-income countries and countries that, for instance, could not generate as much stimulus after COVID-19 could also benefit from stronger sustainable development policies and investments. So I think I'll stop here, Anna, but just to say again, a big thank you for inviting us today and congratulations for the launch of the Explorer, which is a phenomenal tool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for these thought-provoking points. Very interesting. And we can already hear some links between the 2 first interventions, including the power of ranking. So very interesting. Thank you. Let's continue now with our next speaker. Michael, you are the CEO of Social Progress Imperative. And since 2011, the Social Progress Index has really measured social performance globally, giving a picture of how people across the world are living, what are their needs, but also providing an indication of what should happen to improve their lives. And now, over 10 years of doing the Social Progress Index, how do you see the role of data in changing the world? And has it changed? And what kind of stories and messages have been most powerful, in your view, in translating the index results to policymakers and wider audiences? And finally, how do you see the potential of these composite indicators and Scorpus Explorer in making evidence more accessible and bringing data closer to people in support of more sustainable future? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. That's a lot of questions. But maybe I can summarize it very briefly in the quote, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Now, of course, this is Jesus Christ's instructions to his disciples to go out into the world. But I think it works very well for any of us working in the data field trying to get impact in the world. We, of course, are the sheep. We are the ones who believe in the importance of data. and we're going out amongst wolves who are the decision makers of the world. And if we're going to have a positive impact, we have to be, first of all, as innocent as doves. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have to have integrity about our tools. Now, this is an exceptional group of people on this call because we've all collaborated with the JRC and because we all know that the integrity of the tools that we build is really important. But let's be honest, there are some quite rubbish indexes out in the world. Indeed, my 6-year-old child can probably calculate a rubbish index, and a rubbish index can also be very effective in capturing headlines. Just because it's a story that grabs a headline doesn't mean it's a good tool. So the starting point has got to be, you've got to have integrity around your product. I don't think I need to say any more about that because I think that's understood amongst this group. But let's call out the fact that not every index out there does have that kind of integrity. And maybe we should, as a community, be stronger at actually calling out unsatisfactory or misleading products. The second one is about being as the wisdom of serpents. And I think this is all about thinking about what actually is going to drive change in the world. And I think we've actually taken quite a different approach to both Oxfam and STSM with the work that we've done on the Social Progress Index. Because actually we've quite deliberately decided that actually that kind of big global advocacy piece is not our strength. Yeah, we don't have the same kind of infrastructure. I mean, it's described very well about the infrastructure that Oxfam has to drive out those messages. That actually for us, pushing out sort of newspaper headlines is not going to be the driver of change. Other people are much better than we are. So what we're really focused on is how do we position the Social Progress Index as a practical tool that can be used by decision makers, that they can take in and own as their own. So for us, that's involved a couple of things. First of all, it's been how we've moved aggressively around localizing the Social Progress Index tool. So our global index, which we've been doing now for nearly 10 years, is sort of the flagship by which we can compare countries. But the vast majority of our work is now building localized indices for regions, states, cities, communities around the world. That's the majority of our work. So actually allowing the tool to be applied at a localized practical level has been the priority. And when you're doing that, when you're selling that into a regional partner, a city mayor or whatever, you actually selling that in isn't about, hey, you're number 27 in this ranking, you're bad, get better. It's actually a different conversation about, hey, I've got a practical tool that can actually help you achieve your objectives. And actually what you then have to do is find the language to say, I know that you're struggling with this. Here is something that actually help you to solve your problem. So I think for advocacy, having strong, clear, one-size-fits-all messages works in some ways. But in some ways, if you're looking at kind of practical adoption, then you've got to start talking with other people's language, showing that this is a tool that's actually going to help them to achieve objectives. And so that sort of flexibility. And obviously the other part of that is, you have to give them ownership. So, most of our work with local governments, you won't find the data on our website because we're not the owner. The European Regional Social Progress Index sits on the European Commission website, not the Social Progress Imperative website. So obviously deliberately being self-effacing to transfer that kind of ownership. I'm not saying that's the only path. I'm just saying that's the path that we've followed that we think is the most effective path to impact. The other one I think we're really excited about is the way a path to impact and uptake is through the capital markets. And I think creating a tool like the Social Progress Index that can be used by governments and policymakers, but also by investors is very important. And so we're thrilled when we see a footnote in a rating agency report that cites our data as being part of a sovereign rating. That's showing that data is actually being used to reflect on, is this a good country or not? The fact that the social, the real things that matter to real people is part of a calculation about sovereign creditworthiness, to us actually is a very powerful impact story. And actually talking to folks in the capital markets, what they appreciate about Social Progress Index on that basis is in part methodological rigor, it's transparency about the methodology, it's consistency over time, and then also a clear complementarity to other different measures. So if we're thinking about any kind of data tool, there are different theories of change, different pathways to impact, and you have to be very clear about that. And that's where I think, with the Explorer tool you're launching is a terrific resource. I love it, but in some sense, I'm the kind of core audience. We're the people here who will love it. The question for you would be, who do you want to love it? Who are the wolves you want to love it? And what have you got to do to get them to love it and want to use it? And I'd love to, maybe you got an answer for that. I'd love to hear it, because I think it's such a fantastic tool. Getting it out and used will be very, very powerful. I hope that's useful.
Thank you so much, Michael. We always continue learning from you, for sure. Very interesting points about the quality of indices and also localizing the tool and messages. Thank you so much. So let's move next to the European arena with Henrik Simois working with translating data in the form of visuals at the European Parliamentary Research Service. So Henrik, you are a policy analyst and responsible for data visualization at the European Parliamentary Research Service. It's the Parliament's in-house think tank that provides the members research and analysis on policy issues related to the European Union to support their parliamentary work. We all know that politicians are very, very busy, so research communication must be to the point and concise, while also providing all necessary aspects. What are your top tips in communicating research for policymakers? Could you share some practical examples with us with something you have been dealing with lately? What about, how do you see the new tool, Composed Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer, supporting the work of the European Parliament? Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all of the other panelists for the really interesting participation. Well, here in the EPRS, our main goal is to deliver to the members of the European Parliament accurate and truthful information that mostly follow the form of briefings. And here in the service that I work for, which is the Climate Action Research and Tracking Service within DG EPRS, we have been producing a series of briefings already starting roughly 2 years ago, that we have decided to look into the EU progress on climate action and looking towards what each member state is doing. And we understand that it's a daunting task to go through all the data that Eurostat and the EEA has to offer. So we have decided at the beginning of the process to work with both in-house statisticians and also external contractor and our own data visualization team, and to work on a set of indicators. So we looked at total and net greenhouse gas emissions. We looked at LULUCF emissions, carbon intensity of the economy, the share of renewable energies, effort sharing emissions, emissions from cars and vans, and also to energy efficiency through looking into the primary and final energy consumption. So this resulted in a series of 27 +1 publications, the +1 being the European-wide one. And at the end of it, we saw potential in that series to become something that would reside permanently in the internet in the form of an interactive infographic, which was launched a few months ago. The idea behind that interactive infographic is that it is presented in a much simpler way than the briefing does it, as it has very little text, and you can play around, you can compare countries within the same indicator. And the idea is that every year when we have the new approximation data, we would update the web tool. More recently, we'll also look into the international progress on climate action, and we looked into 6 countries. We looked into USA, the UK, China, India, Brazil, and Egypt, as it was hosting the COP. All these documents, they came out pretty recently, just a few days before the Conference of the Parties started, and they have been shared quite a lot within the institution. So we know that those documents that follow the same structure as the previous project did, we know that those documents had a pretty good reach to the people we wanted for them to reach. Currently, we are developing another set of briefings, another series that, unlike the series that we've done last year that looked at the past progress of the member states, we are now going to look at what the roadmap for EU climate neutrality, and looking into each country and looking at what does the country need to do in order to achieve both the EU goals and the own proposed targets. On the Explorer that was presented today, and knowing that we have from EPRS side, we know that it's more and more important that we present our briefings and our findings in a way that it's visually appealing to our targeted audience, the MEPs. And I do believe that the work that has been put into the Explorer can very well serve as a perfect starting point in order for us to build more visually enticing briefings in the near future. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much for sharing these very practical examples. And some of the very practical case studies, let's say, that you share with us have also been shared in the chat on the platform for everyone to take a look. So thank you so much. We still have some time for discussion. So let me pose one more question for all the speakers, or whoever wants to answer. Could you share one or two key recommendations for other data translators, if we can call them like this, that they should have on their radar when communicating and telling stories about data? Who would want to take this one?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, the whole point is know your audience. Who are you trying to communicate with? And again, one of the things we've done recently looking at was later this year, we're releasing a social progress index covering 500 cities in the US. And one of the things we're deliberately not doing is pushing out a big ranking story, because that's just going to alienate a bunch of the stakeholders. So just getting the headline isn't enough if that's going to have the opposite effect of what you want. So customize how you're communicating based on who you're trying to get to.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in also here, Mina. You know, I think in our case, and again, we're not saying that we that we have, you know, achieved everything. So we want to stay modest as well. But I think what we tried to do, especially at the beginning, was to invest in having strong foundations, right? Having something which is as rigorous, as robust as possible. And I think it's also following up from what was said also earlier today on the need to make sure that these indices are built in a sound way. I think, you know, many people are aware of what happened in the doing business case, which can, you know, really put at risk the credibility of the entire work. So I think that's why we started investing a lot of time on the methodology, sensitivity test, transparency, and so on. And then we moved over the years from a report which was called SDG Index, where everything was around the data, the indicators, and so on, to the Sustainable Development Report, where we added a lot more of stories, narrative, and so on around the data part. And I think if I take the Human Development Index, I think they follow the same thing, which is big investment on making sure that they get it right. And then once the methodology is stable, move also more towards the Human Development Report afterwards. And just maybe a quick side note, because it's true that in my intervention, I focused a lot on the awareness part of those indices. I think Michael has a great point, which is also more and more, especially in our case with the SDGs, where we only have a couple of years left to achieve this agenda. We feel like it's no longer enough to put out those indices and hope that they're going to be used. So we're working more and more with those that can use it, actually decision makers in the international system, national governments, private financial institutions, credit rating agencies, the private sectors, and so on, to sort of co-design and work with those indices and see how they can be used. So one example is Benin has issued an innovative financing instrument, an SDG bond. SDSN, through its tool, is actually monitoring year on year the progress that Benin is doing on this sustainable finance instrument. So just to agree with Michael that it's important, besides the awareness aspect, important also to connect with those that can use those tools and instruments.
Thank you so much. Anyone else who wants to chip in? So these were very good points. We heard know your audience and customize the message, the robustness of the measures, and collaboration and working together with others. Anna, should we still take one round of questions, or?
I have the feeling that our time is running. We have just 5 minutes left. So I don't know, maybe if any of the speakers would like to add anything else or pose a question, we could maybe still see this from Slido. I think we don't see any questions. So. Okay. Well, I think this has been a great session, but it's a flash session. We don't have much time here. It was just 1 hour, but I think it was really great to have an overview of all these experiences. So, and also to have the presentation also on the Explorer from Carlos. So I think we got quite a good, rich session here, and we have many takeaways to take with us home. So I think Mina will just wrap up the session and thank our speakers to be here. I think it's really a big thank you to them, and also to all of the persons who attended the session. It's unfortunately time for us to finish. We would love talking for hours about this topic. This is obvious, but unfortunately it's not possible. We look forward to continue these discussions at other occasions. And please remember to visit the Composite Indicator and Scoreboards Explorer. I believe the link was also shared in the chat. And also there you can also have a look at all the indices that have been presented today. And it can also work as an entry point to explore then these indices into more detail. And have a look at our data stories blog that we are launching it today. If you would like to write a data-driven piece that a topic you are passionate about, just get in touch with us. We'll also share our email in the chat. And this is going to be our big thing next year. So thanks again to all the speakers, to all the participants for such an engaging and rich conversation today. With this, I finish. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.